He's Gary Dietrich, political analyst for years for KGO, and now he exists with us here in our new reality. Thank you, Gary. You're so kind to join us here.
Hey, good to be here, Mark. And I wanted to get in the green room early because you remember our last attempt at this was
yes,
by the tech gremlins. Hey, one thing about the COVID China Disney thing, I have absolutely no doubt this was an enterprising teenager who said, you know, I want Pirates of the Caribbean all to myself. I'm calling in a COVID alert. That's what it was.
Yeah, kind of a SWAT thing almost, the way they're, you know, I love the opportunity to speak with you at this moment in time, not only because we're so close to the midterm election, but also because this moment in time, I refer to this time in America. You know, I can't remember, and maybe you can put this in some perspective, which is why I value your presence additionally. I can't remember a time, not only with the divisiveness. I mean, I think there's been divisiveness for, you know, on and off, and it ebbs and flows in different ways, and it manifests in different ways. But the sort of aggression that has taken on even the physical violence associated with some of this aggression, the intimidation of poll workers, I was mentioning it before, the intimidation of public officials. I'm wondering if you could speak to that and then speak to how it might influence the election.
Well, Mark, I do think you're onto something that, you know, many people are concerned about, many people are talking about. And, you know, it is part of a larger concern societally. And, you know, you look back and we had, I mean, let's not forget, during the 60s, during a lot of times, there was significant unrest. I think one of the distinct differences now is that technology has enabled targeting of this that never could happen before. What do I mean by that? You know, you took your placard, you went out on the street, you even maybe went to the mall in downtown DC. You know, you weren't able to target people. Just think of all the social media platforms now. Think of all the ways that people can get an individual's private data, you know, what their cell phone number is, what their address is. I mean, that's at the tip of your fingers on these things. And I think that is one of the larger concerns. And I think it's one of the larger concerns of those who hold public office, as well as those tasked to defend them in law enforcement. And that is, things are closer to home. I mean, remember when we had demonstrations and threats of violence, even against Supreme Court justices in the last year? Now we know, of course, about the Pelosi home in San Francisco. I mean, for some, I think this is getting way too close to home. And I think it is unprecedented, certainly in recent American history.
The personal attacks that are associated with conversation that would normally be about policy, it seems that that is also a transformation that we've seen. The personalizing of things that would otherwise exist in the political sphere. It's an extension, or it might be the catalyst for what you're talking about, which is associated with, now I can ID where that politician who I've demonized or who I've heard is personally responsible for ruining my life. I can identify where they live.
Well, let me put my, you know, sociologist hat on even further. You know, thank you, UC Santa Barbara, for my political social degree. You know, before making my way up to the really expensive place at the Kennedy School. But you know, I think the thing about it is this is part, again, of a larger sociological framework of people yelling at each other. I mean, I love your drop about that. But seriously, through these devices, the level of personal animosity and targeting of that, you know, it isn't just gossiping up and down the street anymore. It's specifically posting things about a specific person and, you know, directing that through their social media flow and all kinds of things. And that has spilled over, obviously, into the political arena. But it's not exclusive to that. Look at how the celebrities are targeted. All kinds of other folks, you know, even in neighborhoods get ostracized. Kids in high school and the concerns about that related to teen suicide. I mean, I think it's unfortunately part of a larger sociological expression of angst, frustration, anger, jealousy, whatever you want to call it, that clearly now is spilled over into the political arena. And it is concerning, Mark. And I think particularly when you think about the fact that to carve out any political policy over time, compromise is absolutely necessary. Nobody gets their own way, left, right, center, whatever it is, all the time. And if you can't have dialogue, and if you can't come to some sense of comedy and compromise, and I mean that was Comity.
Right, and that is a ding word. Go ahead. Yes.
Thank you so much. I told a friend I got to get at least one ding on Mark's show, or I'm not qualified.
Comedy is clearly Comity.
So that's my deal, Mark. I think it's part of a larger sociological framework and problem.
And I love that you made that last point about just that compromise has to be part of the solution. And sadly, it feels as though the power grab that's going on and the rancor and rancor is a ding word too, that has informed the dialogue and debate has less to do with compromise and more to do with, as I say, taking hold of things. I want to ask you about specific races and what to watch. So with election night, as I'll refer to it, but I mean, the results begin to be tabulated as polls are closed, and we still have in various states various different ways of tabulating, various different protocols for tabulating, right? I mean, sometimes I don't understand why you can't process all ballots that come in early. You don't have to count them, but you should at least process them prior to election night. That does happen in some states. It doesn't happen in others. What about what to watch on election night?
Well, California, you are absolutely exactly right about that, Mark, that a lot of people think all of this is federally dictated. It's not. States have their own significant leeway in how they process ballots, when they count them, how they count them. So, for example, in California, those early ballots, those mail-in ballots or early voting ballots are already being processed. But in a state like, for example, a really pivotal state like Pennsylvania, they are clearly, the election officials there are clearly managing expectations because they were reminding people nationwide, look, by state law, we cannot even begin to process the ballots until election day. So that is, they can't be open, they can't be run through the verifying machine. None of that can happen. So that's why, election night will still be key. And I think we're going to clearly know some things, certainly when it comes to the House. I think almost certainly we're going to probably know who's controlling the House that night. But when it comes to the Senate, that may not be the case for two big reasons. One is Pennsylvania, because a very tight race, of course, between Fetterman and Oz. That's become nationalized, that race. And the other one that's nationalized is Georgia. Now, what's the challenge in Georgia? Georgia has very interesting laws of their own. If one of the two candidates, and of course right now that's Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock, if one of those does not get 50%, they go to a runoff a month later. So there is the potential that we will know the control of the House, but if it's as tight as we think it might be, potentially we won't know control of the Senate till the first week of December when that runoff happens.
That's wild. That's wild to consider. In the Fetterman debate, would you have counseled Fetterman to just say, I'm not going to debate, I've had a stroke, and some of my words, you could have made a statement along the lines of what he made in his opening statement during the debate, which is, some of my words come in sort of a labored way to me, but I can think clearly, and I've been certified by doctors, et cetera, and you wave off the debate. That way you're not pilloried by the opposition for what can be anticipated to be a questionable debate performance, since it's all about oratory in a debate. I mean, it's not only about policy, it's about how you communicate that policy. What? Pilloried is a ding word. You're right. Go ahead, Gary. Would you have counseled him against that debate?
Well, I think the Fetterman camp was really, really stuck between a rock and a hard place for a couple reasons. One, because remember that now infamous interview with the reporter, which is probably a larger mistake. When remember, she was nailed because she said, he stuttered and stammered. But when you saw the debate, the interview, you could see some of that. And after that debate, remember, there were even Democrats, many of them saying off the record, not for attribution, but said they never should have done that. As a result of that interview, the questions about Fetterman's capability and his communication skills raised even further than they were. And I think that raised the stakes and, frankly, the pressure on Fetterman and his campaign to put him forward for that debate. Then put also out there something else people rightly pointed out. Oz is a TV guy. Mark, you know how this goes. I mean, if you're experienced in using those kind of formats, you have a big advantage. I mean, witness Ronald Reagan, famously, this guy was at ease in front of the camera, and people noticed that right away. So I think it was really difficult. Had Fetterman not done the debate, the questions would have loomed just as large and maybe even larger. Is he up to the challenge? I think they thought, let's get it out. Let's take our lumps here at least a couple weeks before Election Day and seeing if we can recover on that. The race was already tightening. We don't have any hard and fast evidence, Mark, that there was a major jump in favor of Oz right after that debate. But we do know now that the trend towards Oz and away from Fetterman, which has been gradual but consistent over the last few weeks, has continued. Really, it's coming down to a toss-up next week on Election Day.
You make a really good point, and when you recalibrate how we look at that moment, there might have been no choice. I guess I look at Donald Trump. You know what Donald Trump said when they say, well, you're not releasing your taxes? Everybody releases their taxes. He just sort of said, hey, I'm not, okay? It's being audited, whatever. I mean, he just floated some BS story. You can handle these things. He's still making stump speeches. He's still out there if you want to see him. We don't want to put him in a forum. I don't want to dwell on this, but it's such an important race, and it's so very close. And I think it's interesting that you just alluded to the fact that there might not have been movement. Like, it didn't move the meter much, what happened there. But it just struck me as tactically, while such a difficult situation, admittedly, it still struck me as tactically a mistake. So I want to move on. Nevada is also another very important race that's close.
Absolutely. I mean, our sister state here, it could come down to Nevada. There's a current sitting Democratic senator who's right now in an exceptionally tight race. Republicans think they now have the advantage in this race. All of the Senate races and most of the House races, it's difficult to find right now, Mark, anything but these trending Republican. Now, you got to take a step back and say this is historically the case. I mean, in a first midterm election, literally every president loses seats. The average since World War II for those elections, regardless of whether it's Republican or Democrat, is a loss of 28 seats. And we now have approached those numbers for most of those who create these kind of averages nationwide. In Nevada, this is going to be absolutely critical. This is another one of, there's about 3 to 5 states that really are going to be tipping the balance of power in the Senate, and Nevada is one of them.
So what could the makeup of the House and Senate look like on when the dust settles? Maybe it's December 1st when it really settles. But
go ahead, Mark. I'm sorry.
No. Go ahead, please. That's essentially it.
Yeah, I think the House right now, that cake, I think both sides of the aisle. In fact, there's now word out this morning that the White House is even preparing for a Republican-controlled House. What does that mean? It means we're still going to have a California speaker. It's just that it's not going to be one from San Francisco. It's going to be one from the Fresno area, and that's likely to be Kevin McCarthy. And Republicans almost certainly, because remember, they only need 5 out of 435 seats, that 5-vote swing to gain control of the House. And I think it's widely expected by all the polls that is going to happen. So the real question mark becomes, are we going to have a divided Congress, or is it going to be a united Congress of Republican control against a democratically controlled White House? The Senate, remember, is vitally important to control, not just because, you can advance or block legislation, but really importantly, because of those judicial confirmations. Now, the Senate confirms other posts as well, and you'll have some, and you always do during midterm elections, you'll have some departures from this Biden administration, maybe more if things don't go well for Biden. But you're going to have some departures, and there'll have to be other confirmations, but those judicial confirmations are really key. So what is it going to look like, Mark? Almost certainly we're going to have so-called divided government. We've had a united, front for Democrats here for the last 2 years, but it's going to make tough sledding for budgets. It's going to make tough sledding for other, policy objectives. But let's add one more piece to the puzzle, and that's politics. There is going to be tremendous pressure on President Biden to announce what he's going to do in terms of 2024, certainly before the end of the year, and probably the pressure is going to grow in the next couple of weeks. And it is certainly going to grow, Mark, if they lose substantial numbers in both the House and the Senate, because he's going to be blamed, like it or not, with his 40% approval ratings. A lot of the blame is going to fall at the White House doorstep.
The days of approval ratings that exceed that by much, they may be gone. In this America, Gary Dietrich, don't you think that I don't see, I understand when you get into a war or something, like some huge event may inform approval ratings like George Bush enjoyed those after 9/11, et cetera. But apart from that, I think these kind of lower approval ratings may become the order of the day as we move forward, just in general in politics in America.
You're exactly right, Mark. Just you look at the approval ratings going back, let's say Obama, Clinton, Bush, you rightly pointed out, they were all they were all in the 40s as well. People forget that. They think about Barack Obama was wildly popular, nationally. No, not so. Same thing with Clinton, same thing with Trump, certainly, and you rightly point out the only exception we had to that was after 9/11, when George Bush's ratings were in the 60s at that point in that midterm. But it is tough sledding right now. I mean, in the current political environment, when you have 48, 52, 49 in polls, and, about 4 or 5% throwing up their hands and saying, how about none of the above? It is tough to maintain and sustain any kind of political momentum, and just keep your head above that 50% watermark.
Our last moments with Gary Dietrich, political analyst for years with KGO, and can be seen, as you know, on television as a political analyst as well. You touched on something which I find immensely troubling. There was an op-ed on this over the weekend. It was the politicization of the courts. And so court appointments, which had always been, let's face it, I mean, we've always known, it's been unspoken, that there's a political aspect to some of these court appointments. I'm not talking about the Supreme Court right now. I'm talking about appointments elsewhere in states and localities nationwide. There's now a politicization of that. And there is a fervor about those appointments, a political fervor I'm talking about, that would seem to be redefining the way the courts are going. And in this election, that may be increasingly with a difficulty about getting things done and more being settled in the courts. Increasingly, that might be where policy is actually shaped. I'm wondering if you could speak to that. You touched on it. I find it immensely troubling.
Well, Mark, you're talking about something that's exceptionally important going forward. And let's make no mistake about it. The courts, by necessity, because these cases are being brought to them, are getting involved in elections. I mean, famously, this really started with Bush v. Gore and the Florida Chad count, right? That's where this thing really reared its ugly head in terms of demanding that the Supreme Court and courts lower got involved in elections. But it's happening now all over the country. And this is really concerning because I think the polls are showing this. Legitimacy of the judicial system is being brought into question because of this. And of course, when it came to the Supreme Court appointments of the last year or two, that was exacerbated, or last couple of years, that was exacerbated even more. So we're in a place right now where I know many in the judiciary itself are concerned about it, and certainly our political figures as well. Hey, just a reminder, people can find me on Gary Dietrich at Twitter, at Gary Dietrich on Twitter, or if they want to find the TV stuff, Mark, they can just Google me, Gary Dietrich, and find stuff if they absolutely insist on watching me mess up on TV, not just on radio.
Don't be self-effacing, ding word. You are you're so experienced. It's your takes that are clean. I'm so delighted that you spent time with us, and people should find you at Gary Dietrich. We're all on Twitter for the moment. We'll see what happens with that platform as it changes, but that's a great way to find Gary. And Gary, thanks so much for being with us today.
Of course, Morgan. So, hey, I want to give you and the team some real kudos. Just coming in here today, man. The production values, the job you guys are doing on the show, spectacular. Keep it up.
Oh, thanks, pal. All right, Gary Dietrich, everybody. Thanks, Gary.
Good to see his face today. That's awesome.
Yeah, he's a good one. Really good one. Terrific.